welcome back to MFA Writers. We're excited to be back with you today for the second half of Season 5. I hope you all enjoyed your holidays as much as we did. Today we've got a special debut author episode that I'm really excited to share with you. In the coming weeks, you can expect more interviews with authors, professors, and of course, emerging writers in MFA programs around the country. Those of you who applied to programs this cycle should be hearing back in the next couple months. I wish you all the luck as those decisions roll in, but as you'll hear in today's episode, things in the writing world don't always happen the way we expect. So even if you don't get the decisions you hope for, keep your head up and keep writing. You can find MFA Writers on Instagram and Twitter, as well as mfawriters.com. We love to hear from listeners, so feel free to shoot us a direct message on one of those platforms, or an email at mfawriterspodcast@gmail.com. And if you have a minute to rate or review the show, the best place to do that is on Apple Podcasts. Doing so will help boost our podcast as we try to boost these amazing writers. Also, if you or someone you know would like to be a guest on the show, you can apply at mfawriters.com. On that same website, you can also click the support button to support us financially, if it's within your means. Or you can do so by going directly to buymeacoffee.com/MFAWriters. Finally, as always, thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy the episode. Welcome to MFA Writers, the podcast where we talk to creative writing MFA students about their program, their process, and a piece they're working on. I'm your host, Jared McCormick. Today, I'm super excited to be joined by Meghan Perry for a special debut authors episode. Meghan graduated with an MFA from Emerson College in 2009 and currently directs the Writing Center at St. John's Preparatory School in the Boston area. She's published stories in Cold Mountain Review, Sycamore Review, The Fourth River, and other publications. Her debut novel, Water Finds a Way, was just published this November by Delphinium Books, with an audiobook by Penguin Random House. The novel has received a Kirkus star and been featured in Newsday and Condé Nast as one of the top books of this fall. Today, Meghan has brought an excerpt from the novel to share with us.
Thank you, Jared. Today I'll be reading from the first couple of pages from Chapter 1. There is a prologue to this novel, but I'm going to skip over it for the sake of just being able to jump right into the story. Blake left the car on the edge of the road and took the driveway on foot. It was a rutted vestige of a driveway that spelled death to city cars in mud season. The wind carried curls of wood smoke and a pervasive current of salt, and she walked with her head bent against it, hands stuffed in the pockets of her big coat, the black rope of her braid smacking at her back. Patches of late spring snow still clung to the shaded slope where blueberries once grew. A dark fringe of evergreens shivered icy dew as she passed beneath them. The land was familiar still. She remembered the lichen-splotched knuckles of granite that poked up from the hill like a tease to clumsy feet. When she reached the house, a silvered skeleton of a farmhouse with a sagging roof and boarded windows up top, she allowed herself to pause briefly and acknowledge its emptiness. Then she beat her way through a gauntlet of thorns that clawed her coat. Beneath her boots, rusting discs of beer cans broke apart in the weeds. The loiterers and revelers had all gone. There were only ruins. Her ruins now, her single inheritance. In the rear yard, she found the shell of a rotted-out skiff where her grandmother had once planted marigolds, great buttons of tangerine and gold that bloomed all the way to first frost. She blinked away the memory. The bird bath had toppled and cracked in two. Beside the shed, her grandfather's wooden lobster trap sat decaying like a pile of old rib cages. She pressed past these relics, her eyes hard and determined, her heart an unrelenting drum. The apple tree stood at the edge of the yard. It was a gnarled relic now, whose tattered limbs still sported a few black, shriveled fruits. She knelt beneath it and pressed her fingers to the scarred bark, announcing herself. Then she worked them down to the base of the trunk and searched. Though weeds had engulfed the tiny slate marker, its etched initials had endured 27 winters. She traced them once with a ragged fingernail, then lifted the stone clear, and with her knife commenced to carve at the soil. The job proved difficult, the earth still winter-bound and reluctant there in the shade. She shucked off the coat and blotted sweat from her temples, set her teeth. The urn she found first, a tiny vessel for a tiny purpose. She lifted it out and set it among the slick roots. Her heart shuddered once, then settled. She continued to dig until the blade struck the lockbox. Its weight as she pulled it to her lap reassured her, and when she thumbed the numbers and popped the rusted clasp, she found inside, still wrapped in plastic, the big nickel-plated Smith & Wesson. 6 .357 Magnum rounds popped from the cylinder into her hand. She jangled them like loose change, reloaded them, hoisted the barrel. She pressed it to her cheek until she felt the metal strike her teeth. The wind came softly there below the hill. It washed over her broad shoulders and sighed away across the tidal marsh. She drew slow breaths, her finger bent around the trigger, the damp of the ground bleeding through her jeans. A squirrel skittered through nearby bushes and stopped to peer with its beady eyes. At last, she lowered the gun and zipped it inside her coat. Her first test. She had passed. She reburied the urn and the empty box. When she was satisfied that the place looked no different, she stood and smacked the mud from her knees and retraced her steps past the old front porch. She glanced again at the boarded door with its sun-bleached sign, the broken chair pushed against the railing where she once sat picking out distant stars. Silently, she sheathed the knife that hung muddy in her hand and trudged back down the hill, leaving the house and all its tethered ghosts behind her.
Again, that was fantastic. Thank you so much for reading that. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much, Jared. I'm so excited to join you today.
Yeah, I'm so excited to talk to you. So you've described yourself as a writer who is drawn to the ragged edges of people, places, and dreams. And that is definitely the case in Water Finds a Way, a book that follows several characters who are trying to outrun their past and create some kind of future for themselves under difficult circumstances, as we just heard in that reading. So why do you think you're drawn to those ragged edges and characters? Where does that interest come from?
You know, I think it comes from a lot of traveling and specifically just kind of road tripping around the U.S. to places that are a little off the beaten path. Those types of places have always called to me. I mean, give me a ghost town, an abandoned factory, a little, rugged little northeastern fishing community that really appeals to my imagination. And those are the places I've always loved. Not so much like the huge tourist hotspots that have a million people around them, but the places that feel very lonely and isolated.
Yeah. Have you ever read Blue Highways by William Least Heat Moon?
I have not.
Okay, it's one of our claims to fame. I'm from Columbia, Missouri, and he started his trip from Columbia, Missouri and, traveled through all of those small towns around the U.S. And I just love that book. And that reminded me of it. Something about getting off the big highways and getting off the interstates in particular and going through these small towns of America. You start to get a sense of the diverse culture of America and the diverse experiences of the people and the struggles that people go through and how they're different, but also connected. I don't know. I feel like a sense of that when I read your book.
Yes, I think that people think of America sometimes and Americans think they have to go abroad to find a lot of diversity and culture or whatever. And right here in the US, there are so many different pockets, those overlooked places, and you can learn so much from that. So that was a big part of my upbringing. My parents tried to show me that. And that's certainly something I try to do with my own children now that they are of traveling age.
Yeah. I mean, I was one of those people. I grew up in a tiny town in the middle of Missouri. Didn't really travel much as a kid. And then after I graduated from college, I got a passport for the first time and I moved to Taiwan and spent almost a decade traveling around the world. But it was interesting in traveling abroad. I became more interested in my home country. And now that I'm back, it's all I want to do is, go on road trips and travel around the US and see some of these places that I haven't seen here. So it's interesting. Sometimes you have to go really far away to realize how interesting it is in your backyard, I think.
Yeah, that's awesome.
So what made you particularly interested in the characters in Water Finds a Way? I want to hear you talk about where those characters came from and what it is about them specifically that inspired you.
So these characters I was writing about had been around in my head for quite some time. Some of them started off in a series of short stories I began actually writing back all the way back in MFA. And I came up with them really from the geography itself. I always start with setting as an author. And I think you can't really know a character until you know the geography they're from and everything that is involved and tied to that geography. And so I was interested in a story that explored the experiences of these people who aren't necessarily given a lot of attention in day-to-day American, news or politics or what have you. And the idea of someone who just recently come out of prison and, is rejoining the world of everyday citizenship really fascinated me. And I think also I really am interested in the idea of being an outsider. In some ways, I've always felt a little bit like an outsider myself. I think because I'm an introvert. And so a lot of times I feel like an outsider looking in on a lot of different experiences I've had. So that's kind of the approach I took with all of these characters and what it felt to be kind of on the outsides of things, whether that be because one of the characters had been in prison for 20 years and really had been on the outside of society, or whether it's because, one of the characters has a chronic illness, which prevents her from being, involved in society in certain ways, or even the people in the novel who just come from very much struggling economic circumstances.
Yeah, I mean, I come from like a town that's very different from the one in this book. I'm like in the middle of a cornfield in Missouri, not on the coast of Maine, but very similar in the sense that, it's like a very working class community. And I'm always struck by just like the feeling that people had in that town, whether it was spoken or unspoken, of just feeling a little bit left behind, a little bit like somehow on the outside looking in on, I don't know, where the country was going, I guess. And I got a sense of that when I was reading the book, like these like working class people who are trying to figure out, well, what comes next? Like, where do we fit in like this new America, if you will? So that was like an interesting thing. And, you talked about how important setting is to this book, and having like listened to some of your other interviews, I can tell that like setting is in general, like very important to your writing process. I mean, like I said, this book, Water Finds a Way, it's set in a remote fishing community in down east Maine. It's very beautifully rendered on the page. And you can tell as you're reading it that it's very important to telling the story. It's a huge part of the story. It really feels like the characters and the plot, all of it is very connected to this place. So I'm curious to hear you talk about that a little bit more, like how important the setting was to telling the story and how important it is to your writing process in general.
Sure. I think, Maine itself, first of all, as a state, is a fascinating place. And there are many Maines. Anyone familiar with Maine knows there's not just one Maine. There's southern Maine or northern Massachusetts, as it's called in jest. There's mid-coast, which is becoming much more gentrified. There's down east, which is more remote. And the coastline is just so ragged. It's like thousands of miles if you stretched it all out, if you just took all of that and stretched it all out. And then there's northern Maine, central Maine. So there are a lot of different pockets and different cultures, and it's changing pretty rapidly, particularly post-pandemic. A lot of people moved out of these metropolitan areas and wanted, the extra elbow room, so to speak. And so that's coming in. But down east appealed to me because, obviously it's got such beautiful geography. It's got these iconic rocky shorelines. And so people flock up there to experience that in the warm summer months when it's very pleasant. And then, obviously behind all of that, there's different realities for people who live there. And Maine is a very old state. It's got a very aging population is what I mean. And a lot of young people find there aren't a lot of opportunities. So they have to move out of the state or at least move to the cities. And so down east has this very kind of this loneliness to it, I felt like, in this isolation for people who live there year round. And certainly fishing communities face their own number of challenges. And, lobster fishing itself has changed a little bit with some of the new technologies, but the basic process has kind of remained the same over the years. So it's iconic to many people who think of Maine. They think of lobster fishing, of these solo guys or a couple of guys going out on a boat into the sunrise and catching lobster. But, as with any rural community, down east struggles with a number of things. One of them is the opioid epidemic. And I talk about that a lot in the sense that, Maine is one of the hardest hit states with the opioid crisis. And it's interesting to see how that's affected fishing communities in particular, because they're so remote. The access to treatment, it's very minimal. And so there's also that rugged culture of, I don't want to admit I have a problem. I don't want to seek the help. And so that has a ripple effect for everybody in the community. So that was definitely something that was central to writing this novel.
Oh, yeah. That's to me, a big theme in this book that's kind of running through it. People with pasts, demons that they're struggling with and trying to come to terms with, and also figuring out how to ask for help and how to reach out to other people and, find some way forward through other people. I think the characters in this book are really beautifully written, and the relationships are really beautifully written. And they ring really true for me from coming from a small town. I haven't been to Maine, but I still see in these characters people I grew up with, people I know from back home. So that's a testament to your ability to write characters. And you mentioned that a lot of times when you write a story, the characters actually kind of spring up from the setting. Like you start with the setting and then the characters come from that setting. I'm curious to hear you talk about how that looks in practice. When you sit down to write something, how do you work through the setting, and at what point do the characters start to show up?
A lot of the stories and the novels I write are based on places I have visited many times, that I try to get a great deal of familiarity with these places on the ground, because I feel that's important to the authenticity. You can certainly do a lot of research and read and all of that, and that's important too. But when I'm in a place, I like to watch people, perhaps to a creepy degree. And I like to listen to people. I like to listen to how they talk. I like to, what's playing in the local restaurant, what music are people listening, that sort of thing. And so as I sit down to write these characters in these settings, I try to channel that atmosphere from these observations I've made. And a lot of it, I hear the conversations, the dialogues in my head, and I just have to completely immerse myself in that world. And then I begin building. And always at the forefront of my mind is, how would someone who, let's take, Raker Harbor, fictional town down east, if you don't have access to, let's say super great healthcare, and you're someone like Nora Hayes who has MS, how does that affect your world? How does that affect your day-to-day existence? Who do you have to rely upon for help? How do you have to be kind of self-sufficient, even as you're kind of losing that ability to be self-sufficient? It's really an intense immersion. And it's been so wonderful to hear from people like yourself, but also people, New Englanders, say, this sounds like the people from my town. This sounds like what we're going through. This is absolutely something I've witnessed myself. And that's the best compliment you can get, really, as a writer.
All right. Well, going off of that idea of starting with setting, and from the setting, finding the characters, I was really interested in the way you wrote and talked about the ocean in this story, because to me, it almost feels like a character in this story. Obviously, it's part of the setting, but it feels like this character that is simultaneously providing for and threatening the people in this village, who are interacting with it on a daily basis. So how did you think about the role of the ocean when you were writing this story?
Well, first of all, I grew up in Maine and Massachusetts. The ocean terrifies me. There is nothing more powerful on this earth than the ocean and its destructive abilities. And but also there is, when you stand and you look out on the ocean, there is that sense in your soul, right? That there's something beyond there. You get this greater sense of what might be out there. And so it's really the ocean giveth and the ocean taketh away in real life and in this novel. And for Blake, the protagonist, returning to it is really, it's not a human she's returning to. It's not even really a concrete, solid land place so much as that idea of the open water, that open horizon, that possibility. So for Blake, the ocean is possibility. But for some of the characters who've had to make a living on it, or who've had to have spouses who make a living on it and then lost their spouse, as in the case of Nora, that ocean is kind of this oppressive being that they've just kind of had to learn to live with, and be aware of its power that is greater than them, and have even fallen victim to it. So I was really interested in kind of the way that ocean can play so many roles for different people.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier that this story originally started as kind of a series of short stories before it came the novel. And I wanted to talk about that a little bit. You wrote 3 stories that took place in this setting, Raker Harbor, and follow some of these same characters. One was titled Another Ocean, and it's published in the Fourth River. Another, Changing Water, is in Passages North, and the third, Off Season, is in Sycamore Review. So I really want to hear you talk about those stories and how they became this novel. Did you know when you wrote them that you would eventually turn them into a novel?
I knew after I wrote the second one that I wanted to turn it into a novel. The setting itself just kind of wouldn't let me go. And what I found when I was shopping short stories out to literary journals was that the editors were really interested in this setting. And they were kind of asking me, hey, do you have anything else in this setting? I said, oh my gosh, I'm a full-time high school English teacher at the time. I don't have anything else. I can't write it fast enough. So I knew, kind of put a pin in that I wanted to return to this and write a bigger story. I think the way that my brain works and has always worked, I think in much more novel scale than short story scale. And the short story form was something I had to learn, both, as an undergraduate and then an MFA. And so this had lived inside me for quite a bit. But those short stories actually focused more around the character who became Leland Savard in the novel. And he, as you know, he's a main character in the novel, but he's not what I would call the protagonist. And so I made some big shifts away from some of the plot lines from those short stories in creating this novel. But they were certainly the beginnings of it. And they really helped to anchor me in that imaginary place in Maine.
Tell us a bit about that process, though, like starting with those short stories. You have these 3 short stories. Editors have said we want more. And you're like, okay, where do I go from here? Like, how do I take what I've got here in these short stories and turn them into a longer narrative? What did that process look like?
That process was really quite challenging. Yeah. Obviously, I graduated from MFA in 2009. And to be fair, I dabbled in some short stories. I was beginning my career as a high school English teacher. I moved a couple times. We had children. Like, a lot of life stuff happened and got in the way of really focusing on making it into a novel. But for many years, I struggled to write a novel set in Raker Harbor that really had, again, that male protagonist of Leland Savard. And the plot was different. There were different characters, but it wasn't coming together. And the pacing was a problem. There were a lot of problems with it. And I ended up just having to scrap that. In early 2021, I had to walk away from it after drafting probably thousands of pages of material that just wasn't working. And that was devastating. It was really, really hard to do, but I'd gotten to a point where I just knew that if I wanted to move forward and try again, that I had to start fresh. Luckily, I had spent years crafting that setting, crafting some of these characters who I could kind of retool for a new plot. And so it was a valuable experience. It's tempting sometimes for me to think of that as kind of, 7 or 8 wasted years of my life. But it was practicing the whole time. I was learning a lot from that. And then when I was ready to go on this one, it came out really, really fast. So.
Well, that's a testament to you, I think, just like persevering through that, because I think that's, it's not an uncommon thing that writers go through. They start working on a book, especially their first book, when you don't necessarily know what the ups and downs of the novel writing process are going to be like. I think it's probably really common to get, a whole draft out and be like, I know this isn't working, but like, I want so badly to for it to work, I can't start over. But to be able to listen to that voice and then do it and trust that the next draft is going to be better. I imagine that was difficult, but did you know when you started that second draft, like, okay, like this, I feel like I'm on the right track now?
I absolutely felt like something new and very special was happening. It took bringing in an entirely new character, a new protagonist, and she was the force that drove the entire novel. It was amazing to me how changing the protagonist just completely transformed the work and suddenly made it workable. So, some of the characters I killed off from the prior attempted novel. Other ones, I changed their gender. I flipped things around. It just suddenly, I felt liberated to do that. And in a way that I'd felt really constrained for years trying to make this thing work that just wasn't working. And, it's funny. I call that process when you have to scrap it. I tell my students, at St. John's, I said, sometimes you just have to go scorched earth. You just have to lay waste so that something new can grow. And that's what I had to do. And so I have experienced that pain first person, and I can firsthand rather, and I can relate to students who come in, with an essay or whatever, and they're really reluctant to just stop and start over. But it's so valuable.
Yeah. So much of writing is rewriting and revising, but it can be such a hard process. But yeah, it's interesting to hear that once you gave yourself permission to just try something new, the whole thing kind of opened up. It's really exciting to hear, and good for, I think, listeners to hear that if they're in that same situation, although it might seem like you've wasted time writing that first draft, the good stuff will still rise to the top when you work on that next draft. It'll always come back if it's supposed to be in the story.
Absolutely.
You mentioned that you really prefer writing novels to short stories, but I'm curious to hear you talk about how important it was to kind of master the short story form, if you will, in order to successfully write the novel. Did you find some of those skills were carrying over to the novel writing process?
Definitely. I mean, obviously, when you're writing short story, word economy is so important. And I think the very first lesson I received in MFA was, good writing starts at the sentence level, slow down, hold your horses, look at every single sentence you're writing and make sure that every single one deserves to be in there, and make sure that everyone is crafted to the best of your ability. I had never paid such attention to language before that. And so certainly in the short story, that's very important, but it's equally important in a novel. I mean, readers shouldn't be reading sentences that don't need to be there, in my opinion. And so you learn how to kind of let go of some of your highfalutin ideas of what descriptions need to be like. And that was the most valuable thing I learned from having to write short stories. And then, it also gives you a sense of, pacing, and that there needs to be a problem and you need to move along the plot. Every short story needs a problem. Every novel needs a problem. And then how you pace the action around that is really, that for me is where the hard work takes place. And, I really struggled sometimes in MFA to finish these short stories on schedule for the next class, because my worlds in my head were so much bigger and I had to condense them. And so sometimes what I came up with wasn't always the greatest in class, but I'm really glad I had that experience.
All right. So we've talked a little bit about this journey that you've been on since the MFA to this moment when you're putting out your first book. You graduated from Emerson 15 years ago in 2009. And since then, you've been working as an educator. You've published some stories and you've been working on this novel, which just came out to really good reviews. So I want to talk a bit more about that journey and where it all started. So let's go back to that MFA program. What do you remember from your time in the MFA and how did it prepare you to write this book?
I did my MFA. I went right from undergraduate into a master's degree in education because I knew I always wanted to teach. That was something I definitely wanted to do. Then right out of that program into an MFA because I'd gotten an assistantship at Emerson College. So I was really on the fence about doing the MFA, but kind of financial things lined up. And then that opportunity to continue exploring writing in a serious way, I decided, okay, I'm going to take the plunge and do it. My initial year in MFA, I remember being difficult for me because my very first workshop was with Margot Livesey, and there were some very talented students in that class. And there I was, I felt like I was just like the rookie among these people. And I don't think have the language to talk about writing in the way that they were talking about writing yet, as funny as that may sound. And so I remember feeling really intimidated and shy. And it was really kind of a crash course in learning how to give and take critique. And man, at the time it was tough, but I'm so glad it happened because it equipped me for not only becoming a better writer, but certainly becoming a better teacher and becoming a better writing coach. So I did the MFA in 2 years. You could do it in 3. I did it in 2, mainly because I was anxious to get out and have a real job, quote unquote. And so in retrospect, I wish I'd taken a little more time and slowed down and really appreciated the opportunity to sit in a room and talk about the craft of writing and explore that. And I don't know, I have much more appreciation for it now, 15 years out, than I did when I was there and even a couple years out of the MFA. But I will say I started to see that bear fruit. I think it was only a month or 2 after I graduated where I published my first short story, which I had written while I was in MFA. And that was like a nice little confidence booster. It's like, okay, now I can call myself a published author. I got the short story published. And it was not a Maine story. It was something completely different. But that was I think everybody needs that little, encouragement that someone in the outside world is interested in reading what you're producing.
Another thing you mentioned was that while you were in the MFA, you were working, and you were actually working in a writing center while you were in the MFA. And now you direct a writing center at the St. John's Preparatory School in the Boston area. So tell us about the experience working in the MFA and how it led to this current position.
So I worked at the Emerson College Writing Center, which was a really well-organized and pretty big writing center, I think, for the time. I know that writing centers they've been proliferating ever since. One thing for Emerson, at least who I ended up working with a lot, were international students who were using the center. And that really forced me to look at writing through a different lens and the English language through a different lens. And that was really helpful because some of the things, you start to take for granted when you've been writing a lot and for a long time is the structure of sentences, the structure of paragraphs. Why do we do the things that we do? And then having to figure out how to explain that to someone not familiar with those things, took some time, and it took a lot of compassion too. I absolutely loved it. I think that you learn a lot about people through their writing and through working one-on-one with them through their writing. And that was something that, from the MFA and doing that one-on-one coaching with students, I went into teaching, huge classrooms of students in public school. And, you didn't have the luxury of having those kind of more intimate conversations about the writing process. And you write, whether it's, even just for an essay for class or whether you're writing a memoir or what have you, it's making yourself very vulnerable And I think those conversations are better had one-on-one. And so when I started at St. John's 10 years ago now, and they mentioned, we really would like you to create this writing center and start this writing center, I was over the moon. And I thought, oh my gosh, I had such a great experience at Emerson. I would love to do that. And so jumped right into that, and even got a postgraduate certificate in administrating writing centers. One of those exists, believe it or not. It was wonderful to get back into the graduate school space for a little bit and do that. And it has been so rewarding. And I continue to believe, even in this day and age of AI, where, there's so many other tools emerging now, that one-to-one personal conversation about what it means to write, and how difficult and challenging that process can be is just invaluable. And I think it should be available to all students out there.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Okay, so my background is in high school English education. My undergraduate degree was in high school English education. I've worked as an English teacher abroad and here in the States. I don't have to tell you, Meghan, it's a lot of work. It is a lot of work. So I'm curious to hear you talk about whether it was difficult to manage your time as both an educator and a writer over those 15 years when you were writing short stories and you were trying to write the novel and then struggling through the novel and then rewriting the novel. How did you manage to do all of that while also teaching English classes?
It's a struggle. You have to have patience and you have to have faith. By the way, I had neither when I first started out. So I'm fully acknowledging that. But, when I first started teaching English, my gosh, in New Jersey, and it was the Title I school, and most of the kids actually were first gen, or they didn't speak, some of them didn't speak English. That was a full-time occupation. And so carving out time to write short stories on the side, that I had to just say, I'm going to have to do it in the summer when I have a break. I just had to acknowledge that was a season in my life for being an educator and just kind of picking away at some time for writing. And then, as I became more and more compelled to write a novel, I had to carve out more time for that. But then I had little kids. You're never going to feel like you've got enough time to do it. I think that's something as a writer, you just have to accept. You're never going to feel like you've got enough time. You have to make do with the time that you're given. And you have to be okay with there are going to be diversions from projects. And maybe embrace those diversions, because sometimes they're the renewal that your brain needs when you step away.
Yeah.
And they can actually be valuable, even though you don't think they're going to be valuable to begin with. So I certainly would have loved to have published a book 10 years ago. It didn't happen because I did other things with my life, but I was always practicing.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about that a little bit more, because I think a lot of people go to the MFA with this dream that they will publish their debut book right out of the program and just be like a rocket ship into the publishing industry and to the writer's life. And some people do that, but it's just as common for people to spend years working on getting their first book out like you did. You've described the publishing experience as a long game. So what do you think listeners should know about this process?
I think that number one, you have to remember why you're doing it. And hopefully it's the passion for just immersing yourself in the creative process, regardless of what the ultimate outcome is. You have to love it that much, because if you're just doing it for the end goal, if I want to have a published book in my hand, it may not happen, number one, but number two, I think it's going to feel like an empty victory. And you're going to be sacrificing too many things, because it takes sacrifice. You do have to give up other things. For me, it was a lot of social life at times to get the book done and to get the writing done. The publishing industry, to be honest with you, I'd been out of MFA for at least 10 years when I finished the draft of this book. And I had completely forgotten, you don't just, get an agent right away. You got to send out all the queries and you got to find the right agents. And then once you get the agent, great. But now you got to go through the submission process to publishers. And then you got to wait for the publishers to get back to you. And my experience was a little unique in the sense that, I'd written the book during the pandemic. We started shopping the book out in 2021. So still kind of pandemic-y times, a lot of people not working in the office. And so getting responses from agents and publishers took a long time, probably more longer than most. And also it felt like everybody and their mother tried to write a novel during the pandemic. Right. So they were all trying to do the same thing. So I was up against kind of this wave, which made it even more difficult and more important to have the patience. But you certainly need a thick skin. I think that's another benefit of MFA. You get some of that skin thickening just through critiquing class. Not everything's going to be positive, but that is absolutely what you're going to encounter later on when you're dealing with agents and publishers and editors. And so keep the faith, keep the love of what you do. And if you stop loving it, then it's time to get out, whether you've reached the goal or not.
All right. Well, here we are 15 years later. Your book's out in the world. It's getting really positive reviews. How does it feel? Really
surreal. It's surreal. When I was writing this, at my little corner desk in a bedroom at my other house, I did not ever truly believe that it was going to be published and out in the world. And I think one of the coolest things to me isn't, it's on Amazon, it's getting reviews and Goodreads, whatever. It's my aunt is a librarian. And so she looked up the book on WorldCat or whatever. She's like, it's in all these libraries, like all over the country and even in other countries. And that is something I never stopped to think about when I was writing this, that, people would be reading this book, in all these different states, even in these little like small town libraries. It's popping up and people are checking it out. And I think that's the coolest thing of all. That's really neat to me.
I imagine being an educator makes that even feel a little bit more special.
Yeah, I know. It's that nerdy side, right? It's like, oh, cool. Like someone in Farmington, New Mexico is reading my book right now. No, that's the best. And I think, obviously when it comes to reviews and critics and all of that, that's a slippery slope. You can get addicted to looking at that, and it can derail you just from keeping your love of the creative process. So I try not to look at that too much, but the Kirkus star was incredible. I actually had to look up what it was when I got it. I didn't even know. Like, everyone's like, that's so great. Okay. But that's how long I'd really been out of that space of like publishing and serious writing. And so I had to get back in it and reacquaint myself with all this, but certainly very grateful for that. And it's very affirming. Again, it's surreal though, being 15 years out from MFA and having this happen, you kind of have to like keep pinching yourself. Like, yeah, this is what all of this work led up to. And it wasn't immediate.
Well, I'm super happy for you. And super happy that you took the time to come talk with me today. Okay, so before we go, the last question I'm going to ask. So on this podcast, I usually interview MFA students. And the last question I ask them is, what is one way in which the MFA experience has been different, for better or for worse, from their expectations when applying? So for the debut author episodes, I ask a slightly different version of this. What is one way in which the publishing experience has been different, for better or for worse, from your expectations when you first started submitting?
I think I always kind of knew this before publishing, but it really hit home when I was actually in the thick of it. It's once it gets picked up by a publisher, yes, it's your book, but it's also a bunch of other people's book. And learning to be okay with that and to let go, because once it's out there, once someone else is, offering edits and they're designing the book cover and everything else, that's kind of out of your control. And you have to, let your baby fly. And that's hard. It's hard to let go of something, particularly if you spent years kind of writing in virtual isolation and it's only been yours and you've had control over every little bit of it.
Well, We can all only hope to be so lucky to send our baby flying out into the world. I'm so happy that you got to do that. I'm so happy that this book is out there and people are going to get to read it, including high school students and people in their local libraries. It's a great thing to imagine. Thank you so much for taking some time to talk with me. It's been really great getting to know you and hearing about your process writing this book.
Thanks so much, Jared. And I wish everybody out there in MFA or beyond MFA the best of luck and to continue pursuing your craft in this crazy world of AI and everything else. Stay strong and keep at it.